So today we are going to be talking about mass incarceration, the war on drugs, and the massively harmful effect that it's had on particularly minority and especially Black communities. Now, as we move forward in this country, we are seeing the rapid growth and expansion of a cannabis industry, where because of cannabis's existence as a uh, criminal substance for decades in this country's history, there are so many that are in prison as a result of this thing. So we're going to be talking about how we reached that sort of place historically in this country, as well as talking about the healing that can be done in regards to all of those people and all these communities that are adversely affected by something that is now so profitable. So, to get to the beginning of this, we have to discuss the history of policing in the Black community and how criminalization for all sorts of things has led to this. The history of policing in this country traces itself to in the Northeast with the night watchman patrols, which would often watch for violations in Puritan customs, and in the Southeast for slave patrols that would be roving the countryside for any escaped Africans that might have gotten away from plantations. In the 13th Amendment itself, which abolishes slavery in the United States, it does have a specific loophole in which it is stated that slavery is fully and wholly abolished in the United States, except for as punishment for a crime. And states have the authority to lease their prisoners to all sorts of businesses, allowing for the slavery of people in prison to be a very lucrative business. So now we get into how we reached this position to be filled with Black people. And so we have the Black Codes historically. At the end of the Civil War, the Black Codes were established throughout the South in order to criminalize all sorts of mundane activities for Black people exclusively, including loitering, violation of nonsense curfews, vagrancy, and the like. So now that Black people couldn't be enslaved passively, and you could only be enslaved if you were a prisoner, all sorts of new laws were passed in order to make it so that pushing a Black person into the position of criminal was so much easier to do. The Jim Crow laws are an extension of that, as you had all these new laws created to enforce segregation. And if those were violated, just as with the Black codes, it was just another reason to force Black people into prison where they can be exploited through that loophole in the 13th Amendment. So historically, we can see that as a result of Plessy versus Ferguson, as a result of segregation and the Black codes, the Black community in the United States eventually starts to fight back and fight back hard against these things on a societal level. Brown versus Board of Education represents where this fight was taken on the legal front. This was, of course, a famous, tremendously famous, groundbreaking legal case in which the court decision paved the way for the civil rights movement by making it unconstitutional to have this separate but equal standard that had been established before. That was the groundwork for the entirety of the segregation legal system and legal code. This was how this was fought on the legal front. We, of course, famously have Rosa Parks, the mother of the movement, who was a very strong example of how this, and still the early years, was a situation that was fought on the social front. It feels somewhat redundant to even have to explain what Rosa Parks did or who she was, but obviously, when you have this role model woman, this church-going woman, secretary, it being treated so clearly and brazenly poorly, it was very difficult for anyone, even people that s- believed in this system, to see this and not have a feeling of injustice to some degree. And then after that, we get into the civil rights movement itself. This is beyond the kindling. This is now the full on raging fire. You have all sorts of marches famously throughout the United States. You have all sorts of new leadership, like obviously Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., like Malcolm X. We have all sorts of fronts and voices and opinions, but all heading towards the single destination, the single direction of seeking justice for those in the Black community that have been denied justice for so long. So after the monumental and groundbreaking success of the Black Civil Rights era and movement, there was, of course, the inevitable backlash from the white community that would be unwilling to so easily accept the changes that were so courageously pushed for. One of the most important parts of this particular form of backlash was a changing of the strategy that was brought to the table now in a post civil rights era movement. No longer was it as common to be able to just proudly throw slurs that dominated American discussion regarding Black people before, not after the civil rights movement. And so this is where you have the development of the euphemism, where you have code words to discuss things that you are intentionally discussing, but in a way in which masks your bigoted intentions, a strategy which very strongly lives into the modern day. In addition to this, we have the development of the war on drugs. This was the new targeting system. This was the new battering ram that would lead all of the charges as we move towards the modern form of slavery, which is mass incarceration. In regards to the numbers, the war on drugs, particularly with just marijuana charges, and here, just in the state of Massachusetts recently in 2014, you can see that the arrest rates for Black people over white people is massively farther ahead. We can see that in regards to on the world scale, the United States is leagues ahead of other countries in regards to incarceration rates. And this is because, as we discussed before, the 13th Amendment allows for legal slavery of prisoners, thus making it an incredibly profitable business. It is a truly institutional and self-perpetuating cycle. We have the new form of targeting now that you can't have laws that just specifically target a race via segregation standards. You have your new form of address, you have your new criteria, which is that you are now harshly targeting drug use. You then have the court system, which sends these small time drug related offenders off to prison where they are then legally enslaved. And then through that system, you have mass incarceration. And through the war on drugs, you have a newly legalized and existent form of modern day slavery. So now that we've talked about the history in regards to the foundations of mass incarceration, of the reason why it's profitable, and all of those background facets, we're going to be discussing the potential and the hope for equity, relief, and the healing from the harm that it has caused. So we want to make sure that we are ensuring equity. We have now a flourishing business and industry in regards to cannabis when it has been a criminal offense for decades that has ruined the lives of so many people that were thrown in prison on felony charges for something that is now making others so much money. And it is obviously an issue of great inequity when you have, for decades, so many black and brown people being thrown into prison. And now, once it's legal, the majority, vast majority, on every scale, from ownership to even being an employee of the industry, being dominated by white people in regards to cannabis. So, how can this be healed and how can we move to have this be more equitable? And it is a collective and concerted effort. It has to be something that's intentionally fought for and something that's intentionally championed. Because currently, incarcerated individuals and those with prior arrests and convictions for a large majority of time are unable to get in on this industry in a meaningful way, even in regards for when it's legal, such as in some locations, not having a felony charge within the last 10 years of conviction. That allows you to legally be involved, but even then, you still don't have anything that allows you to get involved on the private level. You don't have any of the connections. You might not have any of the capital when so many of these communities were destroyed by the legal issues relating to this, and now it's doing nothing but continue to work against them just in a different way. So, providing benefit and opportunity to these impacted communities is something of great importance when it comes to talking about this issue of equity. A way in which this can be achieved and a way in which this needs to be achieved is through cannabis community investment. It has to be something that the cannabis community does. It has to be something in regards to actively choosing to help those who have been impacted so disproportionately by this issue. It has to be related to fixing and rehabilitating this relationship and this history to truly do something about helping the victims of this. And it does need to come from the cannabis community and industry itself. So it's important to understand how all of these things are all quite literally still in our current reality. There's all amounts of data and information in regards to how all of these things still bleed into why we need equity in regards to the cannabis industry. We have here just a few of these statistics. We have uh, the number of owners in the cannabis industry is 81% white. Uh, Similarly, even just in terms of number of employees that work in the cannabis industry is 71% white. You just see how still in regards to this, you have entire communities and groups that have been devastated by criminalization of this drug for decades. And now, as soon as it is legal and more importantly, profitable, it is entirely and wholly almost dominated by white men.